So the drivers are on slick tyres, starts drizzling as they're leaving for the formation lap, and then the rain intensifies on the first lap of the Grand Prix. This is worst case scenario stuff for a lot of them out there, and it provided big opportunities for others further down to take advantage, and that's what we saw. This graph here shows pretty much the chaos of the Grand Prix. 89 total pit stops in the race, and it's not many Grand Prix where you see every single possible tyre used. Thanks to George Russell's foray onto the white hard tyre, and thanks to a couple of uses of the full wets when we got it rained off later on. So a really chaotic race. But what I want to look into first is that first pit stop call, because that was the critical moment that reshaped the grid. So Saturday's work was completely negated by the first lap on Sunday. First thing that's evident is pitting at the end of the first lap was the best call, and that is what got you right to the sharp end. The main gainers were these two, Pierre Gasly and Sergio Perez, and then also it was actually Zhou further back, and Leclerc had the chance to do the same, but we'll look at that in a minute. But Zhou ended up second in the race, and these guys pitted end of lap 1, and it started raining really heavily coming through turns 11 and 12, so it wasn't even through the middle sector where the drivers could feel it, get on the radio to their team. It was only in the final sector where the rain was coming in from the south side at Zandvoort. And so the drivers had very little time to react. No team called their driver in. So those that pitted end of lap 1, it was a call from the cockpit, and it was a brilliant call as it turned out. And the reason the teams were all hesitant to bring their drivers in was because they all had the same information, that the weather was just going to be a short, sharp shower, and then it would just dry up very quickly. And of course, you don't want to make 2 pit stops, one for the inters and then one back for the slicks, if it's just going to be 1 or 2 slippery laps. But for Perez, for Pierre Gasly, who I thought had the clearest call, just straight in box, no debate even with his race engineer.
Box, 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 box. Box. Box now.
And for Zhou and the other drivers that pitted end of lap 1, they just thought, no, this is already too slippery for slick tyres. They pitted, and on the very next lap, Perez found 20 seconds compared to the best of the drivers that stayed out on the slicks, and that is why the drivers that pitted later just lost a huge amount. So the next call was, do you pit lap 2 or do you stick to your guns? And that is what the top 2 in the Grand Prix did. Verstappen, followed by Alonso, pitted lap 2, and that was also then the next best call you could make after you didn't pit end of lap 1. And there was a good call from Red Bull, very assertive that time on the radio from Red Bull to Max.
Okay, tyre 4 and box this lap, Max. Tyre 4, box this lap.
Is it really going to make more or not?
Box this lap, please, Max. Box.
Obviously using the data they'd learnt from Checo, and pitted him in. Fernando Alonso followed him in, and so did Esteban Ocon. So 4 drivers with Carlos Sainz as well, who had a decent race, pitted and saved their Grand Prix by pitting at the end of lap 2. If you didn't do that, you're going to be losing out big time. The next question was, do you pit at all then for a set of inters, or do you try and stick it out? And those that pitted from then on actually lost out. If you didn't pit at the end of lap 2, you were better to just stay out on the slicks and do as Albon and Piastri had done and try and just brave it on the set of softs. Norris pitted lap 3, Hamilton pitted lap 3, and even we had pitters on lap 4, Russell and Stroll, and Russell turned down the stop on lap 3, came in on lap 4, and that was disaster stuff for George Russell, who was wondering how he went from 3rd place right to the back of the field. Well, that was the case. Now, in this sort of situation in the cockpit, it's easier to make the big calls if you're not inside the top 10. Perez from 7th, it was a decent call from him. He also had more to gain by taking it, what in theory on the end of lap 1 was a little bit more of a gamble. Whereas if you're leading the race, it's always a little bit harder because you can throw the whole thing away. Whereas when you're outside of the top 10, you've got less to lose by pitting. So brilliant call from those guys, but it questions what other drivers outside of the top 10 weren't doing, gambling it as well, because they could have had that big opportunity. And I think probably the big one for me was Lewis Hamilton, starting down in 13th, also started on the medium tyre there, Lewis. So from outside of the top 10, he had a tough qualifying on Saturday, teammate right at the front of the race. This was the sort of gamble that I think if Hamilton had played from a medium that was working even worse than the softs in the rain, he could have leapt up the order. And with the pace that he and Mercedes then had, he could have been a real threat for maybe even a Grand Prix win, or certainly a podium place. So it was more the drivers that were outside of the top 10 that could have taken the gamble. As it was, impeccable driving from the whole field coming through. when you see on board with Sergio Perez and you see him blasting past those drivers still on slicks, you realise how slippery it was for them. They were all over the place, but kept it out of the wall, and that was really impressive. The second call to then go to the soft tyres was a little bit more obvious. Alex Albon was actually the fastest man on circuit in the Williams here by lap 8. So at that point, the soft tyres were working again, and that is why anyone that pitted too late didn't take any advantage. They pitted, had 2 laps better off, and then pitted again, lost 42 seconds in the stops, and Albon stayed out there. And by lap 8, that was the better tyre, and by lap 10 or 11, everyone else had pitted, apart from Sergio Perez, who was jumped at the lead of the race. And that was really the defining factor then, that first pit stop. Later on, another pit stop call as the rain fell, and here Albon again was a little bit late. He was the main driver to lose out, pitting just that 1 lap too late, and he lost places that could have been maybe a 6th place in the Grand Prix for him. Still managed to get points, but lost out a little bit later on, as did Esteban Ocon, who did fit the full wet. But it was by far the lesser of the dramatic calls. That first call was crucial, and that's where some drivers absolutely made their race.
P3. Let's go! Let's go! Woo-hoo-hoo! Amazing, man, amazing.
What a race! What a race! That's what I like. Really good race. Real race. You guys can be proud. Very well executed.